Hi, everybody. I'm Job. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Remote. And I'm going to talk a little bit about how to start and build a remote first company, and in particular, how to scale them. And if you might be wondering what makes you the person to talk about this, before I started Remote, I built GitLab, where I joined as one of the first team members, and I helped grow that company to the largest distributed company on the planet before COVID. Now it's going to be very difficult. And nowadays I run a company Remote. We call it Remote because we have the domain remote.com. So I think we can actually call it that way, which helps other organizations hire people internationally. And I'll get more into that in a bit. But just to say that I spent a lot of time with companies that are either fully remote today or that start building their team remotely slowly over time. And there's a lot of lessons to take away from that. And so what I'm going to be discussing today over the next 30 minutes or so is how do you start? Where do you start when you start building a remote organization? How do you actually get work done and expand your team from there? And how to maintain a culture and build a culture fully remotely. And then get a little bit into attracting international funding and investors, and how to then leverage that to actually build a great company that can scale. So first off, you have a great idea for a business, and maybe you have already a co-founder, and you say we're going to be a remote first company. Where do you start from that point? The first thing I would say is that if you really want to build a distributed team and you say, oh, we want to just hire the best people on the planet, it's good to start small. And in terms of starting small, what I mean with that in this case is starting with a narrow band of time zones. So for your first several team members, it's significantly easier for everybody involved if you're somewhat close in terms of time zones. That helps you in a few different ways. One, it's likely easier to meet up in person, which is great when you're able to. It's nice to be together. But beyond that, it just helps you have a lot of overlapping hours. As your company grows, you will need less and less of this, and I will get to that. But especially you start early on in your organization, it's much easier. You overcome a lot of the difficulties of remote work by just having a bunch of overlapping hours and being able to quickly hop on a call and do work like that. And then the people that you should hire, and this basically goes forever as you scale the company, this doesn't really change, is that your main focus should be on hiring people that are highly independent, highly proactive, and of course, because you're building a company, that are incredibly ambitious. And you should focus on that over hiring very specific specialists, because what you need early on is that people can just pick up work, find work themselves, and get going from there. It's also significantly easier if you don't have to manage someone, because early on in the company, you just want to get busy, but also as you're remote, you don't want to spend a lot of time managing with each other, because this ends up in you having many, many calls just to discuss work, and you want to avoid as much of that as possible. By the way, if you have any questions, you can just drop them in the chat and I'll try to answer them throughout the session. So that's the very basic side. It's very simple. Hire a small team in a small set of time zone. As you start to scale up, you'll have to think about how can you actually do work remotely. The first thing that you hear if you read about this at all is you have to start working asynchronously. And what asynchronously means is that for you to be able to work together, you shouldn't have to be, to collaborate in the same place in the same time together. If you don't require that, that means that you're working asynchronously. And the best way to do that is to establish a single source of truth for everything that you do. A single source of truth is the one place you go to for that piece of information, for that kind of work that you're doing. The simplest example for this is a company handbook. So rather than just having the processes and the standard ways of doing things in a company in everybody's head and then having to transmit that to each other, you write this down, and you can write this down in an app like Notion, for example, and everybody has access to that. Everybody knows where to find that. And it's a really good start to build an organizational culture where you write things down, because that's the next thing. Like if you start communicating asynchronously and you start working asynchronously, you have to start building a culture of documentation, as I like to call it, which means that if there is some piece of information that is uniquely in your head that other people likely also need, you should write it down. You should document it. And it's not about writing something down in detail. It's not about doing something perfect or finishing a piece of documentation. It's just about having something on paper, or in this case, written down online, accessible for everybody in the team. And then to build a culture around this, if someone asks you a question for information that's accessible in the documentation or not, your reply should be with a link to the documentation. If the documentation exists, you just link directly to the documentation. That way you help the person find, okay, this is where this kind of information is written down. And if it doesn't exist, you write it down and then you link to that documentation. And again, this doesn't have to be a lot. This doesn't have to cost you a lot of time. This costs you just as much time as to write the answer in the chat, for example, in Slack directly. That's literally as simple as it should be. As long as everybody does this, over time, you'll start to build up a large body of documentation, and that will help you a lot as your company starts to grow. So you're communicating asynchronously, you're writing documentation. The next thing you have to think about is the kind of culture you're building as an organization. And my suggestion is to start as early as possible with this. Building a strong culture means that everybody in the organization aligns themselves with that. And it requires iteration. You have to evolve as the company grows. So the earlier you start with this, the better. Strong company cultures are built on top of values. So, for example, the value of, we have several values at Remote, and the first one is kindness, and it's explicitly the first one, because we think this is one of the most important things in the way we do business and the way we interact with each other. And independent of what those values are, it's important that everybody knows this and that you regularly refer back to them. This makes sure that everybody's aligned about how we think about how we do business, how we communicate, and how we deal with each other. Beyond that, it's important to set expectations. What do you expect from people in terms of how they act in work, but also how present they are? Do you require them, for example, and I would strongly recommend against this, do you require them to respond immediately to every Slack message? Or is it okay to have a more asynchronous kind of deal where you're not expected to reply to every incoming message immediately, but rather you're going to rely on asynchronous communication in the sense that if I get a question or I get a whole bunch of questions, I'm expected to reply at some point, but never immediately. Those are important things to establish early on, because then as the company grows, as a leader, you will not be able to convey that to everybody anymore, and it will be individuals conveying that to each other. This is essential to scaling a remote company, that you establish this culture early on, and that all of this is documented. And again, if you have a company handbook, this is very easy to do. I'm gonna have a look at the questions because maybe there's one. Jonathan asked, what platform do you use for writing documentation? So I don't want to be too opinionated about this, because the act of documenting things is significantly more important than where you or what you use to document it. However, what is important is that, one, everybody can access it, that everybody can edit it, that it's searchable and easily discoverable by everybody. And so to meet all those things, you're going to end up with a tool like Notion or Coda or Slide, all of which are good. We use Notion at Remote right now. Let's see if I have any other. I'll get to the rest of the questions later on because they relate to other things I'll be discussing. So you have a company, you have your first hires, you establish your values, your expectations, and a little bit of your culture. Then how do you start scaling up the team? What most companies struggle with as they scale up is, how do we actually find people quick enough? How do we hire people fast enough so that the company can actually grow and we can start doing more things? If you have a remote first organization and you say, well, we can truly hire anyone from anywhere, which is a challenge in itself, but I'll get to that. You're faced with a very different situation in that today, still, the demand for great remote work is significantly larger than the supply of great remote work. And so that means that if you put out a position, let's say for a software engineer, you're likely going to get hundreds of applicants. And so your process has to be designed to account for that. Where, I've seen this many times with companies that go from an office culture where you interview every single person that essentially sends in their cover letter. You go to a process where you have to find a way to review hundreds of applications and intelligently make a decision out of that. Who of those people are you going to interview? Because you're not able to interview all of them. There's a lot of different ways to deal with this, but there's not one specific way. It highly depends on the kind of company you want, and highly depends on the kind of people you want. But it's important to take this into account, that likely that's going to look very differently. There are, however, two difficult things to deal with at this stage. One is you have to be compliant. It's important to understand that if you hire someone in a different country and they are a full employee to you, meaning that they have a boss, you're essentially they're their only employer, they're part of the team like everybody else is, that person needs to be employed through you. That means that they have to have a legal employment agreement between you and the company. And to be able to do that, you need to have a local entity as an employer. Really, the only alternative is to working with a company like remote, and that solves that particular issue for you. Many companies early on decide to hire everybody as contractors. It's important to understand that this is non-compliant and this is not legal unless that person actually is a freelancer and is actually independent and doesn't have like a clear manager in the organization. Then probably they're going to have to be an employee. And not doing so, one, you risk fines and whatnot else. But also in the future, as your company grows, you'll likely want to get to a model where you're much more compliant, and moving people over from contractor to employment status can be a very frustrating situation. So that's one of the two things you have to think about before you start scaling up your team significantly. The other thing is about compensation. And this is a very hot topic to discuss. How do you compensate people around the world? And independent of what your decision is, you have to make this decision before you start hiring people, because they will come in and they will want to understand how much is it that you're going to be able to pay me. And if you just do whatever, you're going to end up with an organization with large income discrepancies, or you're going to run into a situation where you will have people applying that you will not be able to afford to pay. So it's very important that you decide upfront, how are we going to compensate everybody in the organization, and what are the compensations decisions that we're going to make. My advice, what I think is a good place to start, is to say, well, we have a minimum that we offer to everybody. Let's say $30,000 a year. That doesn't seem like a lot in some regions, but in some other regions in the world, that is a lot of money. If you say that is the floor, we will never pay anybody less than that, that's a relatively good starting point. If you have all the money in the world and you have this kind of luxury, what I would suggest is, rather than making compensation an issue, is to make it your superpower. Say, we're going to leverage compensation to hire amazing people. And that can mean all sorts of things. That can mean, we make all our salaries public, we pay everybody the same role, independent of location, the same salary. That's up to you. But there's a real opportunity here to make it your superpower, rather than to make it an issue that's hard to discuss and that causes controversy. I'm having a look again at the chat, at the questions. And I see actually a really great one and about what I was going to discuss next. So how do you build a great remote culture, right? Beyond just the cultural values that you started the organization with, how do you build a great remote culture? And Dragos actually asked, how do you create those spaces where people feel comfortable to speak about what's important to them personally outside of their work? We used to go out to lunch, have team building activities, end of year parties, etc. And now everybody feels more distant. And that's true. I think the most important thing to realize about the difference between an office-based organization and one that works remotely is you lose a lot. That comes from someone that thinks remote companies are the future, but it's important to realize what it is that you lose. When you go to an office, one, you know what to expect, right? Like there's a clear expectation. You're going to walk in, you see your colleagues sitting around the office, maybe someone's at the water cooler, someone's at the coffee machine, you say hi to people, you see the general state in which they are, or sometimes you see who is present and who isn't. And all of that is gone with a remote organization. And that's not necessarily bad, but it's important to realize that there's actually a lot of value, a lot of information being transmitted in these kind of moments, right? If you walk by the water cooler and you have a short conversation with one of your colleagues, that's likely going to be about something personal or even just something casual, but it's not in the context of work. And what happens when organizations start to work remote, especially if they come out of this kind of organization, is that they forget to replace that with something, and they end up only talking with their colleagues in the context of work. We have a meeting because we want to discuss X. We're getting together because we want to collaborate on Y. And that's fine, but you still need to replace those water cooler moments. And how you replace those, that is really up to you. There's not a single magical solution to that. It's part of your culture how you're going to address this. There's a lot of simple things you can do. I always suggest companies to have bonding calls where a subset of people come together. Maybe there's an icebreaker question, or maybe not if they are more comfortable with each other, and they just hang out to hang out. Another great way to bond with people is to play games together. Almost everybody likes games, and there's all sorts of different games. You can play more fancy games like Minecraft, or like really nice games, or simple things like Pictionary or Among Us, for example. Those are really great games to hang out with colleagues and to have a moment of both relaxation, but also to have a moment with your colleagues out of the context of work. And that is so important, because that is exactly what is how bonding happens, what forges the bond between people. And then lastly, if you have a remote organization, it's a good idea to encourage people, after they've been vaccinated, to encourage people to get together. I think, for example, at remote, we have a budget that if you come together with a number of people, remote will pay for any and all expenses. So travel expenses, lunch, and if you want to rent a space, for example, to work together in, we'll pay for that as well. There's nothing wrong with that. And it's great to be together. And I think it's important also to realize that if you're a remote organization, that does not mean that you don't like to be with people. I really like to be with people and go out, for lunch and dinner with them. And you should try to actually encourage people to do so, both as like summits where you bring everybody together, but as well as like in a more casual sense, people that happen to be close together or that, specifically travel to each other to meet each other. Let's see. Matthias asks, what about legal issues when hiring internationally? For example, GDPR. That's a great question. This highly depends on the kind of business that you're in. So at remote, what we do is we actually make sure you're compliant with those laws. And so we think about things like IP, we think about things like, privacy policies and whatnot. That said, there's always this consideration you have to make as a business, where you say, well, we do this kind of business, which, for example, is regulated. Can we actually have employees in a particular country? And that highly depends on your business. Generally, we find that this doesn't matter, but there's definitely restrictions to this. Or, for example, you might not be able to hire people in sanctioned countries, depending on the kind of things that you build or sell and the kind of customers that you have. That's really a one-on-one. GDPR generally isn't a really big problem, but these are very complex issues. If you have specific questions, our team can always help with that, and you can just reach out to them. Let's see where I am. Oh yeah, so about remote culture, the last thing, there's two more things I want to say about this, which is, one, there is not an established model of working remotely. So building a culture remotely and doing things together, whatever I'm saying is things that I've done over the last 8 years or so. But that's also, basically as long as people have been building large remote first organizations. And meanwhile, we've been working in offices for almost 100 years. And so we have a good understanding of what makes an office, what makes a good one, what makes a bad one. There's a spectrum where on one end you have people in suits, bankers, that go to very formal offices and have meetings. And on the other hand, you have offices like the ones of Google that have a big slide in them and have food catered to them. But for remote organizations, we don't really have those established notions yet. And it means that you can't also emulate very much. You can take Remote's handbook or GitLab's handbook, for example, which both are public, and emulate some of that. but it doesn't necessarily mean that it works for you. It doesn't even mean that it works for them very well, because they are also still learning. It's all still very new. And so when you're building a remote organization, you have to treat your company culture and everything you do to support the individuals that work at the company as a product in itself. And that product has to change, it has to iterate, and as time goes on, you have to adopt and adapt and try to improve it. I think that above all is the most important thing. You can't say, this is how we're going to run it, and this is going to work forever. Because maybe in a few years, we have something that allows us to communicate better. For example, at Remote, we recently gave everybody a VR headset, and we hang out together in VR. Now, that's great to hang out together, but you can't really do work there yet. But maybe that will change in a few years. And that might actually be a good way to improve a remote organization. Definitely something that you should start to consider. How can we improve this organization at any point in time? And then lastly, about company culture. Ultimately, it's just about trust. As an employer, you have to trust the people that work in your organization. And the more trust you give them, the more they will pay back. If you do the opposite, if you go in the opposite direction, and you start to worry about, are people actually working? Are they doing work that they should? Are they working as many hours that I want them to? Or maybe you might even consider installing spy software that allows you to see what they're doing or how long they're at their desk or whether they're active. That's the exact opposite direction. All the best companies, they trust their people, and that makes people much more happy. If you feel the need to constantly hover over someone's shoulder, be that in an office or remotely through using particular software, you really are doing it wrong. And it will make people feel very uncomfortable. So Janse asked, how often should the remote team have meeting? More frequent or less? So how often should you have meetings? So my advice is that you should have as many meetings as you feel like having, which is probably not very many. I think one of the biggest risks is that you spend all your day in meetings, and then you feel like at the end of the day, I have to catch up on work. A good way to prevent having too many meetings is to try to avoid having recurring meetings. And another one is to have meetings that are no longer than 30 minutes and only make very rare exceptions to that. With those two things, you get a very long way already, right? No recurring meetings, so you only have meetings when you really feel that it's necessary, and no long meetings, so you have that long slog where you sit, for an hour or even more behind your computer, and it's very easy to just start doing other things. There's also a few basic tricks, right? If you want to share information with each other, don't have a meeting for that. That doesn't make any sense. Just write it down. It should be in the documentation anyway. And if it's not in the documentation, in the documentation as a link to somewhere else. Sharing information is not a good reason to have a meeting. John asks, we have found that the spontaneous meetings are replaced by commenting in public channels in Slack. It opens up the conversation to everybody. What are my thoughts? Well, I think that's actually the right way to go about doing these kind of things. For example, having public conversations in Slack, it makes it very easy for people to pick up on this, and it makes it very easy for them to address it as well. A risk, of course, of Slack is that it's not truly asynchronous, right? If you talk with a bunch of colleagues in Slack at one point in time and 12 hours pass and your colleague in Australia wakes up, they will not see that anymore. Maybe only if they are specifically pinged to it, but it shouldn't be required of every colleague to read every message in Slack or whatever chat tool you use. And so if the discussion is mostly synchronous, but it doesn't require a call, Slack is a great way to do it. But if it's an asynchronous discussion or something that is longer lived, or you actually want input from more people rather than the people that are right now online, it's good to move that discussion to some other place. And that might be your project management tool. It might be where you write your code or where you do your designs or anywhere else. It could even be in your documentation itself, like in Notion, where you can leave comments. All right. I'm moving on a little bit further. And I want to talk a little bit about attracting international funding and investors, because I think that is what many people here are interested in as well. If you're building an organization that is distributed and remote, it's nice to have investors that are very, very well aligned with that. Remote has a number of investors, but most of them are US investors. We have a few international ones. I think the main thing here I can tell you is that if you speak with an investor and they say they really understand remote work and they're really up to the trend, which all of them will say, but then they insist on meeting you in person, they probably don't really understand it. Remote, of course, is a startup that does reasonably well, but most of our investors we've never met in person, and we've only met them through Zoom, and only had calls through Zoom. So that definitely is totally possible. And then second to that, if you are looking for investors or if you're looking for funding, focus on the partners that you're working with and not so much on the big names. There's a few names everybody wants to have on their cap table, but the reality is that when you're actually working together with an investor, you have to work together with the person. And so you have to work with someone that you like, that you can trust, that will support you both in good times, but as well as in bad times. And that is really what to focus on when you're looking for investors. And then ultimately, what does this bring you? Which I think is a valid question. Like, let's say you build a remote first company, and you build a team that is truly distributed with people all over the world. What is the real benefit you reap from that? And how do you then grow a successful business out of that? I think, first off, it's good to think about the impact you'll have on the lives of the many people that will work with you, right? If you build a truly distributed team, that means that you create a team of people of all over the world in different countries that previously probably didn't have access to these kind of opportunities. If not that, at worst, you're going to build a really diverse team of amazing people. And having a great, diverse team will inevitably lead to better decision making, a better understanding of a larger part of the world. And I think that is one of the most important things you can do when you're building a company. I'm going to go through a few more questions. If you have more, feel free to leave them in the Q&A. Anonymous asks, what are the critical success factors in building and maintaining effective relationships with your clients? This is very similar to any other relationship, which is, I think, treat each other with respect. I think building relationships remotely is not necessarily harder than doing so in person, but there's one very big difference, which is the amount of time you spend together. So sure, there's a little bit that you miss from just seeing each other over Zoom rather than seeing each other in person. But the main difference which I experience is that if you're together with someone in person, you have lunch, you easily spend 2.5, 3, 4 hours maybe together. Whereas I would not say yes to anybody that says I want to have a 3-hour Zoom meeting with me, and that makes a very big difference. So it helps a lot to just be kind to one another, and just over text or asynchronously, and now and then have a call. And again, if you can meet someone in person, and this is something you want to build a strong relationship with, it can be worthwhile to actually set up that meeting in person, assuming everybody is vaccinated. And then Jeffrey asks, what is the difference between a good remote leader versus being a good collocated leader? I think there's no difference. I think there's really no difference between someone that is a great remote leader and someone that does great in the office. I do think that people that were perceived as great leaders in the office that then fail in a remote setting were maybe not that great leaders. Maybe they were depending a little bit too much on other factors, the factors of presence. Ultimately, a good leader supports their team, mentors the people that report up to them, helps them unblock things, and is ultimately a servant to the people that report to them, and focuses on helping the organization move forward. And whether you're doing that remotely or whether you're doing that with people in an office, I think it doesn't really matter. I do think it's difficult to be a manager of someone and do that fully asynchronous. I think there's value in actually speaking one-to-one to people, just as like I'm talking to you right now. There's some value into seeing someone talk and having that happen real time. I'm gonna see. Oh, I missed a few questions. So Sirius asked, hi, Job, do you have any interview questions you recommend to filter out potential employees who are truly independent and ambitious? That's a good question. I haven't really thought about that. I think asking someone how they would proceed, like asking a specific direct question is usually not the best way. I think the best way to deal with this is either ask for anecdotes that lead to them either talking about the situation in which they were independent or in which they were ambitious. I think that is a really good way, or giving them a scenario. I'm not a big fan of giving people a scenario because it often feels like child play and it's very easy to fake something, but anecdotes are often very useful. And so asking, for example, someone to give an anecdote of how they were very independent in a particular decision, or if it's for a specific function, it's usually easier, right? So if you ask an engineer, have you ever had a specification that was very vague, and how did you deal with that? That's a pretty good way of finding out whether someone is able to work independently. And it, of course, depends a little bit on a function, how you would address that. And about ambition, I think that is something that is often conveyed through someone's profile and through the things they say in between the questions. I think that's it. I just to wrap up, I think remote organizations, I believe, are really the future of how organizations are going to be built. But we have a few hurdles to cross, and it's very easy to go wrong here if you don't spend time thinking about how you're going to build your culture, if you don't spend time thinking about how you're going to communicate, and how you are going to make sure that people actually bond within your team. All of those things, I think, are addressable. And if you do all of that, you end up with an organization that is highly diverse, can be incredibly flexible, and ultimately give a lot of freedom to the individuals, because they don't have to commute and they can live and work wherever they want. And that, I think, is one of the most amazing things. If you need help with any of this, with hiring people internationally, or just have questions about these things, you can always reach out to us. We're also here on the event, so you can visit the remote team here, but you can also just find us on our website at remote.com. Thank you very much.